One decision changed everything. A motel owner helping a homeless veteran was about to lose everything, until an army of gratitude arrived. When Frank Miller opened his small roadside motel in rural Pennsylvania 15 years ago, he never imagined he'd one day face foreclosure for showing kindness. But that's exactly what happened after he let a struggling veteran stay for free, until something extraordinary happened that changed the course of his life forever. Frank's motel, the Pinewood Inn, wasn't much to look at. Just 12 rooms lined up in a row, with peeling paint and an old neon sign that flickered on most nights. Located on a quiet stretch of highway outside of Millbrook, it rarely filled to capacity. Most guests were travelers looking for a cheap place to crash for the night before continuing their journey. Business had always been steady enough to keep the lights on, but the past few years had been brutal. First came the pandemic, which shut down tourism completely. Then inflation hit, driving up his utility bills and maintenance costs. To make matters worse, a new highway bypass meant fewer travelers even passed by the Pinewood anymore. Frank was barely keeping afloat, living month to month, when James Walker showed up on a cold November evening last year. James didn't look like most of Frank's customers. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried an old military backpack. What struck Frank most were the man's eyes, tired but dignified. "Just need a room for a couple nights," James said quietly, placing a few crumpled bills on the counter, "until my VA check comes through." Frank could tell immediately that James was a veteran. The way he stood, shoulders back despite obvious exhaustion, the military haircut growing out unevenly, and the dog tags partially visible under his shirt. Frank had never served himself, but his father had been in Vietnam, and he'd grown up with a deep respect for those who put on the uniform. As James counted out what little money he had, Frank made a split-second decision. "Put your money away," he said. "Room 8 is available, it's on the house tonight." James initially refused, but Frank insisted. "My dad was military. Consider it a thank you for your service." That one night turned into 2, then a week. James explained that he'd fallen on hard times after his discharge. PTSD made holding down regular jobs difficult. The VA benefits he was counting on had been delayed due to paperwork issues. He'd been homeless for 3 months, usually sleeping in his car until it broke down completely. Frank listened to James's story over coffee in the small motel office. Before he knew it, he'd offered James a job helping with maintenance around the property in exchange for continued lodging. James proved to be reliable and hardworking, fixing things Frank had been putting off for years. What Frank didn't realize was just how dire his own financial situation had become. Behind on mortgage payments for months, he'd been ignoring the increasingly stern notices from the bank. He figured he could catch up eventually when tourist season picked up again. But then came the foreclosure notice. The bank wanted their money, and they weren't willing to wait any longer. Frank had just 30 days to come up with $45,000 in back payments, or the Pinewood Inn would be auctioned off. When Frank broke the news to James, the veteran was devastated. "You're losing your business because you helped me," he said, the guilt evident in his voice. "No," Frank insisted. "I was in trouble long before you got here. If anything, having you around has helped more than you know." But James wasn't convinced. That night after Frank had gone to bed, James made some phone calls. He reached out to members of his old unit, explaining the situation. These weren't just fellow soldiers. They were brothers who had fought alongside him in Afghanistan, men who owed their lives to each other. What happened next, Frank couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. 3 nights before the foreclosure deadline, around 2 a.m., Frank was awakened by the sound of engines. Lots of engines. Looking out his window, he was shocked to see military trucks pulling into the parking lot of the Pinewood Inn. Not just 1 or 2, but a convoy of them, headlights illuminating the night. For a moment Frank thought he must be dreaming. Then his phone rang. It was James. "Come outside," James said, his voice excited. "There's something you need to see." Confused and a little alarmed, Frank threw on a jacket over his pajamas and stepped out onto the porch of his owner's suite. What he saw left him speechless. The parking lot was filled with military vehicles, not official army trucks, but personal vehicles owned by veterans. SUVs with military stickers, pickup trucks flying American flags, and even a few motorcycles with veteran insignias. At least 30 vehicles in total, with more arriving by the minute. James stood in the center of it all, grinning broadly. Next to him was a tall man with salt and pepper hair whom Frank had never seen before. "Frank," James said, "this is Captain Reynolds. He was my commanding officer in Afghanistan." The captain stepped forward and extended his hand. "James told us what you did for him. We wanted to thank you personally." Frank shook the man's hand, still trying to process what was happening. "I don't understand. What is all this?" "This," Captain Reynolds gestured to the gathering crowd, "is the 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, or part of it anyway, James's unit. When he told us about your situation, we made some calls." Another vehicle pulled up, and a middle-aged woman stepped out, carrying a large metal box. She approached Frank and introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, the unit's former logistics officer. "We took up a collection," she said, opening the box to reveal stacks of cash. "It's not just from us. Word spread through veteran networks across 3 states. Everyone wanted to help the man who helped one of our own when he needed it most." Frank stared at the box in disbelief. "How much is in there?" $57,842, Lieutenant Martinez replied precisely. "Enough to cover your back payments and give you some breathing room." Frank's legs nearly gave out beneath him. James quickly moved to support him, guiding him to sit on the motel steps. "You can't do this," Frank stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "It's too much." Captain Reynolds knelt down so he was eye level with Frank. "When we were overseas, we learned that you never leave a man behind. That doesn't stop when we come home. James is our brother, which makes you family too now." By sunrise, the parking lot of the Pinewood Inn resembled a military encampment. Veterans had set up folding chairs and small tables, sharing coffee and swapping stories. Some had traveled hundreds of miles after receiving word about the impromptu mission to save Frank's motel. But they didn't just bring money. As the sun climbed higher, they unpacked tools from their trucks, paint brushes, hammers, power drills, and lawn equipment. Without being asked, they began working on the motel property. Teams formed organically. A group of former combat engineers assessed the building's structure, identifying critical repairs needed. Others started painting the faded exterior, while another group tackled the overgrown landscaping. Inside, rooms were deep cleaned, fixtures replaced, and decades of deferred maintenance addressed. Local news caught wind of the story and sent a reporter. By noon, community members began showing up with food, additional supplies, and offers of help. The mayor arrived, promising to fast-track any permits needed for the renovations. Frank moved through it all in a daze, overwhelmed by the generosity. James stayed by his side, making introductions and explaining how they knew each other from their service days. "Did you plan all this?" Frank finally asked James during a quiet moment. James shrugged. "I just made a few calls. I told them how you took me in when nobody else would, how you gave me back my dignity. The rest just happened." By the end of the weekend, the Pinewood Inn was transformed. Fresh paint in warm, inviting colors replaced the peeling exterior. The flickering neon sign had been repaired and updated. Inside, the rooms sparkled with new fixtures, refurbished furniture, and modern amenities that Frank could never have afforded on his own. But the most significant change wasn't physical. The story of the veteran rescue mission had gone viral, spreading across social media and national news outlets. Reservations began pouring in from people wanting to support the motel that had helped a veteran in need. On Monday morning, Frank walked into the local bank branch, carrying the metal box containing enough cash to pay off his debt and save his business. The bank manager, who had been unwilling to work with him just days before, now welcomed him warmly, having seen the news coverage. "Mr. Miller," the manager said, "we're prepared to offer you new terms on your remaining mortgage. In fact, several local business leaders have contacted us about creating a fund to support veteran employment at your establishment." The Pinewood Inn wasn't just saved, it was reborn with a new purpose. Frank and James developed a program to offer temporary housing and jobs to veterans experiencing homelessness, giving them a chance to get back on their feet just as Frank had done for James. 6 months later, the motel was operating at full capacity most nights. 4 additional veterans had joined the staff, each bringing unique skills from their military service. The parking lot had been expanded to accommodate the increased business, and a new sign proudly displayed, "Pinewood Veterans Inn, where no one stands alone." The transformation went beyond the physical property. Frank, once a solitary man who kept to himself, now found himself at the center of a community. Regular gatherings of veterans took place in the motel's newly renovated common area. Local businesses partnered with Frank to provide job opportunities for veterans who stayed at the inn. James became the unofficial ambassador for the program, using his connections within the veteran community to identify those in need. His own PTSD improved as he found purpose in helping others who were struggling as he once had. One evening, almost exactly a year after James first arrived at the Pinewood, Frank found him sitting outside room 8, the same room he had first stayed in. "Penny for your thoughts?" Frank asked, sitting down beside him. James smiled. "Just thinking about how different things were a year ago. I was at the end of my rope when I walked in here. Never imagined this is where we'd end up." "That makes two of us," Frank agreed. "I was saving my last bit of hope offering you that room. Turns out it was the best decision I ever made." "You know what my commanding officer used to tell us," James said. "He'd say one person can't change the world, but they can create a ripple that becomes a wave." Frank looked around at his transformed motel, now a beacon of hope for veterans in need. "Pretty big wave from where I'm sitting." The story of the Pinewood Veterans Inn continued to inspire others. Similar programs began popping up at motels and hotels across the country. Veterans groups organized renovation raids for struggling business owners who had helped former service members. Frank received letters daily from people touched by his story. Some sent donations to support the program. Others shared their own experiences of kindness and connection. Many were from fellow motel and small business owners inspired to start similar initiatives in their communities. Perhaps the most meaningful letter came from a young soldier currently deployed overseas. "Mr. Miller, you'll never know me, but hearing about what you did for James and what his unit did for you has made a difference to me and my squad. Sometimes we wonder if people back home still care about what we're doing over here. Your story reminds us that the brotherhood doesn't end when we take off the uniform. Thank you for giving us hope." Frank had that letter framed and hung it behind the front desk. The bank foreclosure notice that had once threatened everything Frank had worked for was now displayed prominently in the motel office, not as a painful reminder, but as a symbol of how close they had come to losing it all and how completely things had turned around. Next to it hung a photograph taken on that pivotal night, Frank standing in shock as dozens of veterans saluted him in the headlights of their vehicles. It was a moment that crystallized something essential about America at its best: how communities can rally around those who have given themselves to service, and how one small act of kindness can set in motion a cascade of goodness that transforms many lives. Frank's father, the Vietnam veteran who had instilled in him respect for those who served, hadn't lived to see what his son had accomplished. But Frank liked to think he would have been proud, not just of the help offered to veterans, but of the way the community had come together to embody the values his father had fought for. On the one-year anniversary of the night the convoy arrived, Frank and James organized a celebration. Hundreds attended, including most of the veterans who had participated in the original rescue mission. Captain Reynolds, who had since become a regular visitor to the inn, raised a toast. "A year ago, we thought we were coming here to save a motel," he said. "What we didn't realize was that we were really building a home, not just for veterans needing a fresh start, but for all of us who needed to remember what it means to be part of something bigger than ourselves." As the applause died down, Frank stepped forward. He wasn't a natural public speaker, but he had something important to say. "Before all this happened," he began, "I was just trying to keep my head above water. I let James stay because it felt like the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return. What I've learned since then is that sometimes the greatest gifts come from our moments of greatest vulnerability. When I was about to lose everything, I found something more valuable than I ever could have imagined: this community, this purpose, this family." He gestured to James. "This man didn't just save my motel. He reminded me why we're all here, to look out for each other when times get tough. That's not just a veteran value, that's a human value." The Pinewood Veterans Inn stands today as a testament to how a single act of kindness, multiplied by a community of caring people, can create something extraordinary. What began as one motel owner letting a homeless veteran stay for free became a movement that continues to change lives. Frank still works the front desk most days, greeting guests with the same quiet dignity that first impressed him about James. He doesn't consider himself a hero, just someone who made a decision from the heart when it mattered most. But to the veterans who have found renewal within the walls of the Pinewood, Frank represents something essential, proof that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone, and that sometimes salvation arrives not as a miracle from above, but as a convoy of brothers and sisters who refuse to leave anyone behind. That's the real story of the Pinewood Veterans Inn, not just of a motel saved from foreclosure, but of a community rediscovering what it means to take care of its own. One room, one veteran, one act of kindness at a time. If you want to hear more inspiring stories about communities coming together to help veterans, click the video appearing on your screen now. These moments of humanity remind us all what's possible when we look out for each other.